A Brother Like That by Dan Clark. Sometimes being a brother is even better than being a hero. A friend of mine named Paul received an automobile from his brother as a Christmas present. On Christmas Eve, when Paul came out of his office, a street urchin was walking around the shiny new car, admiring it. "Is this your car, mister?" he asked. Paul nodded. "My brother gave it to me for Christmas." The boy was astounded. "You mean your brother gave it to you and it didn't cost you nothing?" "Boy, I wish," he hesitated. Of course, Paul knew what he was going to wish for. He was going to wish he had a brother like that. But what the lad said jarred Paul all the way down to his heels. "I wish," the boy went on, "that I could be a brother like that." Paul looked at the boy in astonishment. Then impulsively he added, "Would you like to take a ride in my automobile?" "Oh yes, I'd love that." After a short ride, the boy turned and with his eyes aglow said, "Mister, would you mind driving in front of my house?" Paul smiled a little. He thought he knew what the lad wanted. He wanted to show his neighbors that he could ride home in a big automobile. But Paul was wrong again. "Will you stop where those 2 steps are?" the boy asked. He ran up the steps. Then, in a little while, Paul heard him coming back, but he was not coming fast. He was carrying his little crippled brother. He sat him down on the bottom step, and then sort of squeezed up against him and pointed to the car. "There she is, buddy, just like I told you upstairs. His brother gave it to him for Christmas, and it didn't cost him a cent. And someday, I'm going to give you one just like it. And then you can see for yourself all the pretty things in the Christmas windows that I've been telling you about." Paul got out and lifted the lad to the front seat of his car. The shiny-eyed older brother climbed in beside him, and the 3 began a memorable holiday ride. That Christmas Eve, Paul learned what Jesus meant when he said, "It is more blessed to give." Thank you.
The story is entitled The Peacekeepers' Coffee. It is one of the most beautiful compensations of life that no man can sincerely try to help another without helping himself. Ralph Waldo Emerson. It was a long drive to Okeechobee, over 2.5 hours in a convoy of the Canadian M113 APCs, that's an armored personnel carriers, which rattled and shook as they kicked up clouds of dust along the dirt roads of the former Yugoslavia. The 4:30 a.m. start was no big deal. Neither was a long drive and diet of road dust. Those came with the job. No, it was the attitude of the locals that was starting to wear on our sense of humor. When we got to Okeechobee, we passed by the usual war-torn, roofless brick houses with their weed-infested yards. Some of the intact houses had Serbian villagers still living in them, determined to stay. As our carriers rumbled past, they would either give us a curious look, a scowl, or simply ignore us altogether while they tended their gardens and eked out their existence. We would wave or just act like they weren't there, both sides engaging in mutual tolerance. Today, our job was maintenance patrol, a nice name for cleaning up after someone else. It was a never-ending routine of repairing damages or replacing materials stolen by the desperate local population. The men kept grumbling about the constant cleanup. I kept hearing, "Just let the 2 sides go at it and sort it out. Isn't that what they want?" I was a sergeant in charge of an 8-man section responsible for a defensive area in the corner of the village. This defensive area was a couple of houses that we had previously cleared of glass and other debris born of conflict. We had then fortified the buildings with sandbags, chicken wire, and lumber. We would routinely check on its sturdiness, then grudgingly clean up more debris and replace stolen corrugated iron, wire, plywood, and sandbags. Look at the bloody mess, someone cursed. I cut him off. Let's just get the job done, I snapped. The day's not getting any cooler. I had left Canada months ago, full of high ideals about helping second or third world countries, protecting the downtrodden and saving all the homeless children. We were going to set everything right and make the world a better place. I was not so sure now. I was no longer the noble liberator I had first envisioned myself. Every report I heard of torture, infanticide, or execution was starting to wear on me. Every time some drunken villager pointed an assault rifle or a pistol at us or told us, "Get out of my country," I thought how pointless this was going to be. To top it off, our own Canadian media back home was relentlessly criticizing us every step of the way. I wondered if there was anyone benefiting from this misery. I was now numb to the loud griping I was hearing today as the soldiers hauled the sheets of corrugated iron. Other days I would tell them to keep it down. But today, between the constant cleanups, restacking sandbags, and make-work projects from headquarters, such as making flower beds, I really no longer cared. I turned my attention back to the unloading of the APC. The men were starting to get careless and were flinging off the supplies. There was so much flying metal, dust, spit, and swearing, I was about to shout something. Then suddenly, this young woman appeared. I'd never seen her before, and I had no clue from which shell-ridden house she'd come. But there she was, carrying a tray of small ceramic cups. Right here, amongst the crumbling buildings, bullet-holed walls, and broken glass, was this young Serbian villager with a tray of what smelled like coffee. She approached us just like she was serving up some friends at a tea party. She was a slim woman with well-kept dark hair, but the lines on her worry-etched face, along with her missing teeth, made her look older than her probable late 20s. Despite the sadness in her dark eyes, she spoke cheerfully in Serbo-Croatian as she offered the tray to me, hostess style. It was a curious sight. Well, my mother had always taught me that it was rude to refuse hospitality. The show no favoritism rule could bend some. "Over here," I hollered at my section. "Come on for a coffee break." "Havla, thank you," I said, gratefully accepting some of the small cups full of floating coffee grounds. I sipped it carefully as one by one, the soldiers in my section each grabbed a cup, like kids after candy. The stuff was warm and bitter, and I don't even like coffee, but I drank it just the same. I replaced my cup on the tray with another, havla, followed by some theatrics to describe delicious. Some of the guys gave a humorous performance of coffee that rivaled Homer Simpson with a donut. She cheerfully said something, flashing that sweet, missing tooth grin, and then she walked away amongst the rubble. Her head was held high, and her walk was proud. I wondered how she could be like that when she had likely lost everything. For all we knew, that might have been her last of her coffee, something that she normally reserved for her own family's meager meals. And there we were, 6 healthy, fit Canadian soldiers with food in our bellies, money in the bank, and a few $1,000s of dentistry in our mouths. Back home in Canada, we had our homes and our families, safe and waiting for our return. We all must have been thinking the same thing. For the next few hours, sweat poured off us like running water as we worked hard into the late afternoon. Only now, there wasn't a single gripe coming from anyone. Doug Setter, Winnipeg, Manitoba.
A comfort food. Growing up, my favorite comfort food was peanut butter and banana sandwiches. As I grew up, my taste became more refined, and now my comfort food is Well, let's face it, it's still peanut butter and banana sandwiches. Not only is it easy to prepare, but there is nostalgia associated with it. It is my soul food. In some ways, using the term soul food or comfort food to describe what Jesus did, turning a meager and basic survival meal into something that fed 5,000 people. Jesus says to us all, "Come, sit and eat with me and be transformed. See God in your midst, be comforted, and nourish your soul." Jesus, of course, is called the bread of life. Even his birthplace, Bethlehem, has meaning. In Hebrew, Beth means house, and Lahem means bread. Jesus then was born in the house of bread. Matthew's version of the feeding of the 5,000 story begins following the devastating news that John the Baptist was beheaded. Jesus and his disciples were grieving. The crowds were confused, they were sad, and they were hungry. Jesus sits with them for the afternoon, talking to them, feeding their souls. Throughout the afternoon, Jesus may have realized something, that in our grief there are times when we may want to be alone, but what we need is to be surrounded by our community. We as a community would do well to remember that being together is nourishing. Seeming to know this all the more as night approached, Jesus decided that instead of sending them all away, they needed to have a meal together. Sometimes in our grief, it is not about what you eat, but with whom you eat it. The disciples obviously have their worries. They looked around and they could see very little, 5 loaves and 2 fish. What can they do with so little? Jesus, however, looked at the same things the disciples looked at, but where they saw not enough, he saw plenty. Plenty of time, plenty of food, and plenty of possibilities with the resources at hand. Jesus knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that wherever there was plenty of God, there would be plenty of everything else. Stepping away from the story, there is a sense that this is rather timely for us. I hear the realities of the church, the truth about an aging congregation, the challenges facing a church in decline. And these are all concerns that must be listened to. However, if Jesus can turn 5 loaves and 2 fish into a meal for 5,000, imagine what God can do with a church that is full of wisdom, generosity, joy, and experience. We often feel limited by our limitations. We see scarcity and are held back when in fact there is plenty. We may not have plenty of children, but we have plenty of God's children. We may not have plenty of youth, but we have plenty of youthful spirits. Wherever there is plenty of God, there is plenty of everything else. Imagine what miracles can be done in this place. We often expect miracles to happen in an instant, but perhaps miracles happen over time. We expect miracles to come directly from God with little of our own actions. I often use the mantra, let go and let God, and it's a good one. But sometimes we shouldn't just let go, but rather get going. Jesus uses his words carefully when instructing his disciples. He says, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. Jesus is not offering to do the miracle alone. Jesus is not offering his own bread. That, of course, will come later. Jesus tells them to look around, solve the problem. This is one you need to solve on your own. Of course, I'm here to lend a hand, but look around you and see the possibilities. Stop waiting for a miracle and participate in one instead. You know, in the Lord's Prayer we say, give us this day our daily bread. It isn't give us this day your daily bread, or give us this day my daily bread, but our. Soul food isn't about the ingredients, but rather who you are eating it with. We may have meager ingredients that at first don't look like much, but when they are brought to Jesus, the flavor is abundant. So let's bring what we have, bring who we are. Leave what we don't need and use all the rest so that God's will is plentiful in this place.
Amazing Grace by Shirley Short. My mother's singing left a lot to be desired. Her lack of talent didn't stop her from belting out the songs from our church hymn book, loudly and off-key. While I'd seen her scare a few crows away from the corn patch, I personally loved it. When she was hoeing a half-acre of weeds in the garden, her screechy but cheery voice convinced me that although she was working hard, she enjoyed the time she spent in meditation. If I happened to go through the barn while she was milking the cattle, her rendition of Rock of Ages might vibrate through the rafters. I'd hear her on her way to the henhouse to collect eggs. The strains of Standing on the Promise echoing across the knolls were almost musical. Without a doubt, her favorite was Amazing Grace. She not only sang it, but she believed that hymn. She sang it so heartfelt and gratefully, there was no doubt she placed herself within the words when she sang. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. I often woke to those lyrics as she'd cooked pancakes on a cold stove in the kitchen and went to sleep with them ringing in my ears as she tucked me under the comforters at night. When she passed away at her request, we played Amazing Grace at her funeral. I thought my heart would burst with all the memories it brought back. But as the final notes faded away, I felt joy knowing, as a woman of great faith who knew that grace had brought her through the danger, tolls, and snares, and grace had led her home. Many years later, as I waited nervously in the cardiac care clinic at my local hospital to have a stress test done, I was not physically able to perform the standard treadmill exam, so my increased heart rate would be clinically induced. The small room was crammed with patients and their supportive family and friends. I suddenly wished I had allowed my daughter to accompany me. I had stubbornly insisted on going alone. As the minutes ticked by, my nerves frayed even further, and I longed for my mother. I realized what she meant when she said, no matter how old you get, you never quit worrying about your kids, and you never stop wanting your mother, especially in a scary situation. I tried to fix my eyes on the television. Cheers and applause from the Price is Right game show filled the air. I turned away, not wanting to think about Bob Barker, new cars, and the fact that my entire future, or lack thereof, hung on the results of the stress test. Suddenly, the unmistakable strains of Amazing Grace filled the room. With the song came a deep sense of peace and solace. Had someone switched the channel? No, because the screen showed a young woman jumping up and down, having just won a trip to an exotic beach. Other patients in the room were riveted by the game show. This rendition of my mother's favorite hymn was for only my ears. I felt calm as I had realized I was not alone after all. I clung to the words from the seldom sung fourth stanza. The Lord has promised good to me. His word, my hope secure. All this happened about 10 years ago. My heart was so filled with my mother's love and my father's grace that there was no room for a blockage.